This is slide 4 of the Industrial Revolution unit on the captains of industry. This is where we get to start to talk about some of the really big names here in the Industrial Revolution. Those men that, these tycoons who make incredible sums of money on all of these inventions that we've been talking about. So now let's talk about the men behind them and how they go about making all of this money. Okay? The first couple of things we're going to talk about are business tactics, like ways to make money. And we will start with what's called a trust. And the big guy here is someone we're going to talk about later on, but a man named John D. Rockefeller. Okay? If you've heard Rockefeller Square, Rockefeller Center, Rockefeller anything in New York City, this is the Rockefeller of that Rockefeller. Okay. Now, a trust was, again, it's a business tactic, a way of making a lot of money. And these men found ways to avoid competition, because competition is bad for making money, good for the consumer. But Rockefeller used a trust. Okay? Rockefeller makes his money in oil, and we'll talk about the oil industry later on. But he runs a company called Standard Oil. Okay? And in a trust, stockholders or the owners of smaller oil companies would turn over their stock to the board of directors of Standard Oil. And then the trust, controlled by Standard Oil, would run all those oil companies as one. Okay? And the bigger Standard Oil got, every time it took over another little company and added to the trust, the more powerful it got. So Rockefeller would go to the owners of these small oil companies and say, look, I'd like you to join my trust. I would like to run your company as part of mine to avoid competition. And if the owner said, no, I like my company, I want to run my company, Rockefeller would say, well, good luck trying to run it. And then Rockefeller would destroy the smaller oil company. He would run them out of business. So you could either hand over control of your company to Rockefeller, or you could lose your company entirely. Right? Now, Rockefeller did make it worth your while. If you agreed to hand over the stock to your company, he would agree to put you on what's called a board of trustees, because this is a trust. And then you, as former owner of your company, you would be a trustee in the Standard Oil Trust. Okay? So you still made money on your company. Rockefeller ran it, and because there's one less oil company for him to compete with, the more money he can make. Okay? Now, some of you are sitting there thinking, wait a minute, isn't this a monopoly? It can be, yes. Every monopoly started as a trust, with one company taking over smaller ones. Okay? Not every trust has to become a monopoly, where one company owns everything. A trust could just be that, one company owns 5 other ones, and it stops right there. So every monopoly started as a trust. Not every trust has to become a monopoly. That's kind of the difference there, and we'll talk about that more on later on. All right, another guy you need to know here, a man named J.P. Morgan, and there you see J.P. Morgan down at the bottom of the screen right there. J.P. Morgan made his money in banking. Okay? He was known as the banker's banker. When banks needed a loan, they went to J.P. Morgan. Okay? He was that rich. He had that much money. Okay? If you needed a loan, let's say you owned a small business, and you went to the banks to get a loan to maybe save your business or to grow your business or whatever, usually to save it, and the bank turned you down, you went to J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was your last resort, because if you were to J.P. Morgan asking for a loan, he knew the banks had turned you down and you had nowhere else to go. So Morgan would tell you, I'd be glad to give you a loan, but here's the condition. Okay? He said, here's your money, and in exchange, I want to put some of my people on your board of directors so that I make sure the decisions that are being made for your company are ones that are good for my company as well, for my bank. And if you said, no, that doesn't sound very fair, he'd say, okay, no loan. Good luck going finding another one. So you're sort of stuck. Right? He would put members of his business onto your board of directors to make decisions for you. That's what's called an interlocking directorate. You're locking together the board of directors, a directorate, an interlocking directorate. He puts his people on your board of directors. It's a way of making sure that your company doesn't blow the money he just gave you. All right, let's move on here, okay, and talk about the second of our three real big industries. We said railroads, the first one. Our second one is going to be steel. Okay? And steel becomes a big deal, as we talked about with the railroads, when it is able to be produced in very large quantities, very quickly, and very cheaply. And that is possible because of something called the Bessemer process. Okay? The Bessemer process. This was developed by a man named, obviously enough, Sir Henry Bessemer. Okay? Now, if you look up here at the top of the page, here you see two men. Okay? Two men figured out how to make steel very quickly, very cheaply, right about the same time. One of them, this guy right here, is William Kelly. He's actually from Kentucky. Okay? There's William Kelly. This guy, Sir Henry Bessemer, is the second one. They both discover the secret right about the same time. But Bessemer patents the process just shortly before Kelly does. Otherwise, this would be known as the Kelly process, and Kelly would be the incredibly rich guy. But he's not. Now, here's how a Bessemer converter works. Okay, here's Bessemer on the right there. That's the guy. Here's his converter. Okay? Here's an actual Bessemer converter. As you can see, it's a couple of stories tall. As tall as this building. These are big, big contraptions. Okay? Now, they're made out of steel. People could always make steel. That wasn't the problem. The problem was it was just a very slow process. Okay? What Bessemer discovers, and Kelly, but we'll just say Bessemer since he's the guy that gets the credit for it. What Bessemer discovers is that, well, let's back up a second. Where does steel come from? Okay? Steel comes from iron, or specifically iron ore. You mine iron ore from the mountains. Okay? You melt down the iron ore, okay, and you made iron. You made things out of iron. The problem was iron was very brittle. It chipped and it broke pretty easily. It rusted very quickly. So when you made rails out of iron, they would rust and start to bend, and then your trains went off the tracks, and that was very bad. Iron rusted, it was very brittle. What they discovered was that if you heated iron hot enough, what you were left with was a much stronger metal, and that was steel. What was happening was that when you heated the iron, you boiled off, or you burnt off, carbon. And carbon was what was causing iron to rust. What you were left with was steel. So you would take this converter right here, this big egg-shaped thing that's opened on top. Here's a cross section of it. Okay? And you would dump all your iron ore inside your converter. You would light a fire down here underneath it. Okay? It would melt the iron ore. The carbon would come out of the top, burn out of the top of the converter. And then when you're left with liquid molten steel, you'll notice it's on hinges, you would tip this over, or this way toward you as you're looking at the screen. You would tip it over and pour out the steel into whatever form, shape you wanted. Okay? Now, the key here, what Bessemer discovered was, in order to get the fire hot enough to burn off carbon, you had to add, of all things, go figure, cold air. So they would hook up a tube and constantly blow cold air into the fire down here. That would make the fire hotter and hotter and hotter. If you've ever cooked on like a charcoal grill, if you ever fan the charcoal or blow on the charcoal, it gets bright red hot. That's the same thing. They would blow cold air down here. It would heat up the iron ore, melt it, carbon burnt off. You're left with steel. Okay. Now, Bessemer figures out how to do this. The guy who does it is a man named Andrew Carnegie, or it's technically Carnegie. But we in America here, he's a Scottish guy. We in America have sort of slurred it into Carnegie. Okay, Andrew Carnegie, and if you've heard of Carnegie Hall, this is the guy that's named after. Carnegie will become the big name in steel. He starts buying up steel mills and building Bessemer converters. Right? By 1900, he's been in business for a little bit then. By 1900, his company, Carnegie Steel, was producing 1/4 of all the steel in the United States. A quarter of the steel was made by one man, Andrew Carnegie. His company made $40 million in profits a year. He personally, by the time he paid all his bills, he personally profited about $25 million a year. Right? Now, eventually, Carnegie grows tired of the steel industry and decides he wants to sell his company. Well, one of the few men in the country who's wealthy enough to actually buy Carnegie Steel is our old friend J.P. Morgan, the banker guy down here. Okay. Oh, by the way, here's Carnegie right there. There's his picture in the middle. So Carnegie will sell Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan, who combines it with other steel companies that he buys up, much like his interlocking directorates, and a trust. He'll use a trust as well. He buys other steel companies and founds what is called U.S. Steel in 1901. He buys Carnegie's company for over $400 million in 1901. $400 million. That's over $11 billion with a B, $11 billion today. Carnegie would have been paid for his company. U.S. Steel would become America's first billion-dollar corporation. Now, let's talk some more about Carnegie. Carnegie believes in something called philanthropy. And philanthropy is giving away your fortune to charities. Okay? A philanthropist is the person who gives away his fortune. Carnegie was a philanthropist. Okay? He believed that if you were rich simply because God chose you to be rich. He gave you you still had to work hard for it, but God gave you the brains, He gave you the intellect, the wisdom to be able to make money. And as a rich person receiving these gifts from God, it was your responsibility to pass along these gifts to the less fortunate. So Carnegie uses his fortune to found orphanages, hospitals, libraries, museums, charities, you name it. Okay? Carnegie does a lot of good with his money. Of his $400 million he got for his company, over the rest of his life, he gave away $350 million worth of it. endowing all these scholarships and charities and museums and libraries and hospitals and all this stuff. Gives away 350 million of the 400 million. The other 50 million he leaves to his family, his children. Okay? Now, Carnegie sums up his belief on money, that the rich have an obligation to take care of the poor, in a book he writes called The Gospel of Wealth. Okay? The Gospel of Wealth. This sums up Carnegie's beliefs about wealth and riches, that the rich have a duty, a moral obligation to take care of the less fortunate. There's a famous quote in the Gospel of Wealth that says, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." The man who dies rich dies disgraced. That if you die still having all your money, you haven't given it away to help others, you have died as a disgrace. You've led a disgraceful life. Okay? So Carnegie doesn't just preach, give, give, give. He actually does. He gives away his money. Okay? That the rich have an obligation to take care of the poor. Now that is a very different idea from a movement in the country at the time called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism. Charles Darwin's theories were very popular at the time, early 1900s. And Darwin comes up with the theory of evolution, that all things have evolved from a simpler form of life. The survival of the fittest, right? That all life forms have evolved from a more simpler form. That those that are still around today are still around because they adapted. They changed to meet the needs and they survived. Those that didn't change died off. Okay? That was Darwin's theory. There are two economists named Herbert Spencer and William Sumner. They are social Darwinists. Okay? Spencer and Sumner. And they will take Darwin's evolutionary theories of physical evolution and apply them to economics. And they'll say that the rich are rich because they simply demonstrated greater abilities than the poor. They worked harder than the poor people did. In fact, it is Spencer, Herbert Spencer, and there you see their names up here at the top. Spencer's the guy on the left. There you see Spencer. It's actually Spencer that coins the term survival of the fittest, not Charles Darwin. Okay? That really poor people were poor because they lacked the work ethic to succeed. The rich simply worked harder than the poor. Now that's a very different sort of philosophy and a theory than Carnegie's, the rich have an obligation to take care of the poor. Spencer and Sumner would say the poor are poor because they didn't work hard, they didn't adapt. If they die off, so be it. Okay? It's two very different ways of looking at how you get wealth and then what you're supposed to do with it once you have it.